American Men of Mind by Burton Egbert Stevenson. Chapter 3, Writers of Verse, Part 2. So we come to the man who measures up more nearly to the stature of a great poet than any other American, Edgar Allan Poe. Outside of America, there has never been any hesitancy in pronouncing Poe the first poet of his country. But at home, it is only recently his real merit has come to be at all generally acknowledged. Edgar Allan Poe was born in Boston in 1809, a stroke of pure irony on the part of fate, for he was in no respect a Bostonian, and it was to Bostonians especially that he was anathema. His parents were actors, traveling from place to place, and his birth at Boston was purely accidental. They had no home and no fortune, but lived from hand to mouth, in the most precarious way, and both of them were dead before their son was 2 years old. He had an elder brother and a younger sister, and these three babies were left stranded at Richmond, Virginia, entirely without merit. Luckily, they were too young to realize how very dark their future was, and the Providence which looks after the sparrows also looked after them. The wife of a well-to-do tobacco merchant named John Allan took a fancy to the dark-eyed, dark-haired boy of 2, and, having no children of her own, adopted him. It was better fortune than he could have hoped for he was brought up in comfort in a good home, and his foster parents seem to have loved him and to have been ambitious for his future. He was an erratic boy, and was soon to get into the first of those difficulties which ended by wrecking his life. For entering the University of Virginia, he made the mistake of associating with a fast set with whom he had no business, and ended by losing heavy sums of money, which he was, of course, unable to pay, and which his foster father very properly refused to pay for him. Instead, he removed the boy from college and put him to work in his office at Richmond. Edgar felt that, in refusing to pay his debts, his foster father had besmirched his honor. The thought rankled in his soul, and he ended by running away from home. He got to Boston somehow and enlisted in the army, serving for 3 years as a private. At the end of that time, there was a reconciliation between him and his foster father, and the latter provided a substitute for him in the army, and secured him an appointment to the military academy at West Point. Why Poe should have felt that he was fitted for army life is difficult to understand, since he had always been impatient of discipline, but to West Point he went, and very promptly got into trouble there, which culminated at the end of the year in court-martial and dismissal. He knew that his foster father's patience was exhausted, and that he could expect nothing more from him, and he soon proved himself incapable of self-support. He drifted from New York to Baltimore, often without knowing where his next meal was coming from, and finally, at Baltimore, his father's widowed sister gave him a home, and he soon married her fragile daughter, Virginia Clem. But he had long been a prey to intemperance, and his habits in consequence were so irregular that he was unable to retain any permanent position. The truth seems to be that Poe was of a temperament so intensely nervous and sensitive that the smallest amount of alcoholic stimulant excited him beyond control, and he lacked the willpower to leave it alone altogether, which was his only chance of safety. Yet he had gained a certain reputation with discerning people by the publication of a few poems of surprising merit, as well as a number of tales as remarkable and compelling as have ever been written in any language. That is a broad statement, and yet it is literally true. Not only is Poe America's greatest poet, but he is still more decidedly her greatest short story writer. So much the greatest that, with the exception of Nathaniel Hawthorne, she has never produced another to rival him. If further testimony to his genius were needed, it might be found in the fact that he was still unable to make a living with his pen, and was forced to see his wife growing daily weaker without the means to provide her proper nourishment. His sufferings were frightful. He was compelled to bend his pride to an appeal for public charity, and the death of his wife wrecked such moral self-control as he had remaining. The rest is soon told. There was a rapid deterioration, and on October 3, 1849, he was found unconscious in a saloon at Baltimore, where an election had been in progress, and where Poe had been made drunk and then used as an illegal voter. He was taken to a hospital, treated for delirium tremens, and died 3 days later, a miserable outcast, at an age where he should have been at the very zenith of his powers. The pages of the world's history show no death more pathetically tragic. Such a death naturally offended right-thinking people. Especially did it offend the New England conscience, which has never been able to divorce art from morals, and as the literary dominance of New England was at that time absolute, Poe was buried under a mass of uncharitable criticism. It should not be forgotten that he had struck the poisoned barb of his satire deep into many a New England sage, and it was perhaps only human nature to strike back. So it came to pass that Poe was pointed out not as a man of genius, but as a horrible example and degrading influence to be sedulously avoided. With foreign readers, all that counted for nothing. They were concerned not with the life of the man, but with the work of the artist, and they found that work consummately good. They were charmed and thrilled by the haunting melody of his verse and the weird horror of his tales. In his own country, recognition of his genius had grown rapidly of recent years. Within his own sphere, he is unquestionably the greatest artist America can boast. He climbed Parnassus higher than any of his countrymen, and if he did not quite attain a seat among the immortals, he at least caught some portion of their radiance. After Poe, the man whom foreign critics consider America's most representative poet is another who has been without honor in his own country, and almost whom, even yet, there is the widest difference of opinion, Walt Whitman. Whitman was ostracized for many years, not because of his life, which was regular and admirable enough, but because of his verse, which is exceedingly irregular in more than one respect. Whitman was by birth and training a man of the people. His father was a carpenter, and, after receiving a common school education, the boy entered a printer's office at the age of 13. A printer's office is, in itself, a source of education, and Whitman soon began to write for the papers, finally going to New York City, where for 12 years he worked on Newspaper Row as reporter or compositor, making friends with all sorts and conditions of men and entering heart and soul into the busy life of the great city. The people, the seething masses on the streets, had a compelling fascination for him. Tiring of New York, at last, he started on a tramp trip to the Southwest, worked in New Orleans and other towns, swung around through the Northwest, and so back to Brooklyn, where he became, strangely enough, a contractor, a builder and seller of houses. He had been reading a great deal all these years, but as yet had given no indication of what was to be his literary life work. And yet, fermenting inside the man and at last demanding expression was a strange new philosophy of democracy, all tolerant, holding the individual to be of the first importance, male and female equal, the body to be revered no less than the soul. For the promulgation of this philosophy, some worthy literary form was needed. Poetry, since that was the noblest form, but poetry stripped of convention and stock phrases, as fluent and free as the people and the land and the great system of democracy which it was to celebrate. With some such idea as this, not outlined in words, not perhaps very clearly understood even by himself, Whitman set to work, and the result was the now famous Leaves of Grass, a collection of 12 poems printed by the author in Brooklyn in 1855. Like most other philosophies and prophecies, it fell on heedless ears. Few people read it, and those who did were exasperated by its far-fetched diction or scandalized by its free treatment of delicate topics. In the next year, a second edition appeared, containing 32 poems, but the book had practically no sale. Then came the Civil War, and Whitman, volunteering not for the field but for work in the hospitals, proved that the doctrine of brotherly love, so basic to his poems, was basic also to his character. "Not till the sun exclude you, neither will I exclude you," he had declared, and now he devoted himself to nursing, on battlefield, in camp and hospital, doing what he could to cheer and lighten the worst side of war, an attractive and inspiring figure. Lincoln, looking out of a window of the White House, saw him go past one day, a majestic person with snow-white beard and hair, his cotton shirt open at the throat, 6 feet tall and perfectly proportioned. And the president, without knowing who he was, but mistaking him probably for a common laborer, turned to a friend who stood beside him and remarked, "There goes a man." And Whitman was a man. Up to that time, he had never been ill a day, but 2 years later, at the age of 53, his health gave way, under the strain of nursing, and from that time until his death, he was physically a man in ruins. Mentally, he was as alert and virile as ever. He was given a clerical position in one of the departments at Washington after that, remaining there until, in 1873, an attack of paralysis incapacitated him even for clerical labor. Meanwhile, he had issued his poems of the war under the title Drum Taps, and had softened some hostile hearts by the 2 noble tributes to Lincoln there included, "O Captain, My Captain," and "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed." But his poetry brought him no income, and for a time, after his removal to Camden, New Jersey, where the remainder of his life was to be passed, he was in absolute want. Friends increased, however. His poems were reissued, and his last years were spent in the midst of a circle of disciples who hailed Whitman as a seer and prophet, and were guilty of other fatuities which made the judicious grieve and did much to keep them alienated from the poet's work. Since his death, his fame has become established on a firmer basis than hysterical adulation. But it is yet too soon to attempt to judge him, to say what his ultimate rank will be. It seems probable that it will be a high one, and it is possible that, centuries hence, the historian of America letters will start with Whitman as the first exponent of an original and democratic literature, disregarding all that has gone before as merely imitative of Europe. Of our lesser poets, only a few need to be mentioned here. Bayard Taylor, born in Pennsylvania in 1825, of Quaker stock and reared in the tenets of that sect, at one time loomed large in American letters, but it is doubtful whether anything of his has the quality of permanency. His personality was a picturesque and fascinating one, and his life interesting and romantic. A poor boy, burning with the itch to write, and especially to travel, at the age of 19, making his way to England and from there to Germany, spending 2 years in Europe, enduring hardships, living with the common people, and finally returning home to find that his letters to the newspapers had been read with interest and had won a considerable audience. These were the first steps in his struggle for recognition. He collected his letters into a book called Views Afoot, which at once became widely popular, and his reputation was made. But it was a reputation as a reporter and traveler, and Taylor, much as he despised it, was never able to get away from it. He became, perforce, a sort of official traveler for the American people, journeyed in California, in the Orient, in Russia, Lapland, in most of the out-of-the-way corners of the world, and his books of travel were uniformly interesting and successful. They do not attract today, not as Park Benjamin put it, because Taylor traveled more and saw less than any other man who ever lived, but because they lack the charm of style, depth of thought, and keenness of observation which the present generation has come to expect. During all this time, Taylor was struggling with pathetic earnestness for recognition as a novelist and poet, but with poor measure of success. His novels were crude and amateurish, and have long since become negligible, but his verse is somewhat more important. His travels in the East furnished him material for his poems of the Orient, which represent him at his best. His ambition, however, was to write a great epic, but for this he lacked both intellectual and emotional equipment, and his attempts in this field were virtual failures. These failures were to him most tragic. Not only that, but he found himself financially embarrassed, and was forced to turn to such hack work as the writing of school histories in order to gain a livelihood. But his friends, of whom he had always a wide circle, secured him the mission to Germany, and he entered on his duties in high spirits, only to die suddenly one morning while sitting in his library at Berlin. A generous, impulsive, and warm-hearted man, Bayard Taylor will be remembered for what he was, rather than for what he did. Two other poets, whose deaths occurred not many months ago, have made noteworthy contributions to American letters: Edmund Clarence Stedman and Thomas Bailey Aldrich. Of the two, Aldrich was by far the better craftsman, his verse possessing a wit, a daintiness, and perfection of finish which sets it apart in a class almost by itself. In prose, too, Aldrich wrote attractively, but always rather with the air of a dilettante, and without the depth and passion of genius. Stedman also possessed wit and polish, though in less degree, and the verse of both these men is delightful reading. More recent still has been the death of a man whose verse ranks with that of either Stedman or Aldrich, Richard Watson Gilder. Some of his lyrics are very beautiful, but they appeal to the intellect rather than to the heart. Perhaps for this reason, as well as for a certain lack of substance and virility, his verse has never had a wide appeal. Two men whose names have become household words because of their delightful verses for and about children are Eugene Field and James Whitcomb Riley. Field is the greater of the two, for he possessed a depth of feeling and insight which is lacking in Riley. Few lyrics have been more widely popular than his Little Boy Blue and Dutch Lullaby, while Riley's Little Orphan Annie and The Raggedy Man are equally well known. Alice and Phoebe Cary are remembered for a few simply written lyrics. Julia Ward Howe's Battle Hymn of the Republic lives as the worthiest piece of verse evoked by the Civil War, and Joaquin Miller is known for a certain rude power in song, but none of them is of sufficient importance to demand extended study. It will be noted that among all the poets who have been mentioned here, not one was distinctively of the South. Poe's youth was spent in Richmond, but he was in no sense Southern. Indeed, the South has only three names to offer of even minor importance: Sidney Lanyard, Henry Timrod, and Paul Hamilton Hayne. None of these men produced anything of the first order, and much of their verse is marred by amateurishness and want of finish, the result in the first place of defective training, and in the second place of an incapacity for taking pains, of a habit which relied too much on inspiration and too little on intellectual effort. For verse to be perfect must be polished like a diamond, slowly and carefully until every facet sparkles. This means that the right word or phrase must be searched for until it is found. Perhaps you have read Mr. Barrie's inimitable story, Sentimental Tommy, and you remember how Tommy failed to write the prize essay because he couldn't think of the right word and would be satisfied with no other. Well, that is the spirit. Somebody has said that easy writing makes hard reading, and this is especially true of poetry. Inspiration doesn't extend to technique. That must be acquired, like any art, with infinite pains. Of the three poets, Lanyard, Timrod, and Hayne, Lanyard was by far the greatest, and has even become, in a small way, the center of a cult. But his voice, while often pure and sweet, lacks the strength needed to carry it down the ages. He is like a little brook making beautiful some meadow or strip of woodland, but only mighty rivers reach the ocean. Lanyard is memorable not so much for his work as for the gallant fight he made against the consumption which he contracted as a result of exposure in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. The war also played a disastrous part in the lives of both Hayne and Timrod, for it impoverished both of them and did much to hasten the latter's death. Timrod, too, rose occasionally to noble utterance, but his voice is fainter and his talent more slender than Lanyard's. His life was a painful one, marred by poverty and disease, and he died at the age of 38. Hayne's work is even less important, for he did not, like Timrod and Lanyard, touch an occasional height of inspired utterance. His name is cherished in his native state of South Carolina and in Georgia, where his last years were spent, but his poems are little read elsewhere. Timrod and Hayne were both born in Charleston, South Carolina, as was a third poet and novelist who, in his day, loomed far larger than either of them, but who is now almost forgotten, except by students of American literature, William Gilmore Simms. Few American writers have produced so much: 18 volumes of verse, 3 dramas, 35 novels, and volumes of short stories, and about as many more books of history, biography, and miscellany, and none of like prominence in his day has dropped more completely out of sight. In common with the other Southern writers we have mentioned, Sims lacked self-restraint and the power of self-criticism. Genius has been defined as a capacity for taking pains, and perhaps it is because Southern writers have lacked this capacity that none of them has proved to be a genius. Elbert Hubbard says that Sims courted oblivion and won her by returning to the South after having achieved some success in the North. But it is doubtful if this had anything to do with it. The truth is that Sims' work has lost its appeal because of its inherent defects, and there is no chance that its popularity will ever be regained. And yet, while his verse is negligible, although he always thought himself a greater poet than novelist, some of his tales of the Carolinas and the Southwest possess a rude power and interest deserving of a better fate. Certainly, Sims seems to have been the best imaginative writer the antebellum South produced. American imaginative literature today resembles a lofty plateau rather than a mountain range. It shows a high level of achievement, but no mighty peaks. Novelists and poets alike have learned how to use their tools. They work with conviction, but in clay rather than in marble. In other words, they work without what we call inspiration. They have talent, but not genius. This is perhaps partly the fault of the age, which has come to place so high a value upon literary form that the quality of the material is often lost sight of. Let us hope that some day a genius will arise who will be great enough to disregard form and to strike out his own path across the domain of letters. Meanwhile, it is safe to advise boys and girls to spend their time over the old things rather than over the new ones. There is so much good literature in the world that there is really no excuse for reading bad, and the latest novel will not give half the solid entertainment to be got from scores of the older ones. One of the most valuable and delightful things in the world is the power to appreciate good literature. To have worthy friends on the shelf, in the shape of great books, is to insure oneself against loneliness and ennui. End of Chapter 3, Part 2. Recording by William Tomko.